And love to know what brought you here today, and like what about the term respect is tapping into your interest, and especially in the workplace. Now, I'm just going to start us off with a little bit of context here. Respect in the workplace is definitely something that we need to work on. We talked about why civility is absolutely something we need to work on, and it's a bit different. And we know that only about half of workers actually feel their employees have really cracked the code on fostering respectful interactions in the workplace. Would love to know if this kind of matches how you're feeling. And even in our own research into understanding civility and respect, even the definitions sometimes blur. And so it's hard to actually understand, what is civility in the workplace and how do we actually get to respect? So the first thing, I just want to throw it out to Janet, and she's been doing a lot of work on pulling these two apart, what it means, both of these in the workplace. And I'd love to know what you think. What's the difference between civility and respect?
Thanks, Emma. Well, there definitely is a difference. And, as a writer, a former English major, and somebody who studied Latin for way longer than I ever needed to, I'm always sort of interested in the words we use for things. So if we think about the difference between civility and respect, it may be helpful to even go back to the roots of the words. Civility comes from the word civilis, which is all about society and how we're expected to act as citizens. But respect, on the other hand, comes from respectus, which means the act of looking back. And respectus comes from the verb respicara, which means to look back, regard, and consider. So civility is more about maintaining social order. And in the workplace, it's, social order there too. So it can be superficial. It can be being polite. It can be just following the rules without any genuine regard for another person. It's kind of like the minimum standard of behavior in a professional setting.
Mm.
But when you start talking about respect, that runs much deeper. That requires seeing the inherent worth of a person, appreciating their unique qualities, and believing that they deserve to be treated with dignity. And without that, any display of respect is just civility in disguise, and it's very superficial. It might look polite, but there's no real meaning to it. Civility is a ceiling when you don't value somebody sort of inherently. And you might follow the social etiquette, you might avoid being offensive, and you might maintain a professional distance, but you're not going to go the extra mile to understand another perspective. You're not going to advocate for somebody's needs, and you're not going to be able to create a space where somebody truly feels like they belong.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Janet. Some deep thoughts. I often see things in terms of the brain's organizing principle, which is like, minimize danger and pain and threat and maximize reward. It's you can sort of represent it as a horizontal line with sort of positive on one side, negative on the other. And to me, like civility is like the absence of negative. So you're neutral. Like civility is like taking away the negative. So there's just no conflict, right?
Right.
Whereas respect, if you start at neutral, respect is about adding positive. So you're actually creating positive conditions for people to bring their full selves in. I think that's a really interesting distinction. And just looking at the comments in the chat too, some really interesting insights from folks. And firstly, if you did miss last week's session, Evan just put it in the chat. You'll see it there, so you can download that and listen to it. But I think there's a couple of interesting comments, like there's a difference between trying to change people's beliefs and changing their behaviors. Like maybe civility is just getting people to behave differently. We're not trying to change their beliefs. We're just saying,
Exactly.
this is how you make a sandwich, and this is how you interact with a person when you're not comfortable with them. Like there's a standard. It's behaviors. That's what kind of civility is. We're not trying to change your opinion about people or something. You just do things differently. And yeah, some other interesting comments. In the difference between intent and impact, I think is a really common challenge and important discussion in organizational contexts. Is often such a big gap. So yeah, I think last session was really interesting. It opened my eyes to the challenges of civility or incivility, and I think the science that we started to unpack was really until I sort of saw it, I wasn't sort of clear how much the science would be useful. And then once we mapped it out, it was like, oh, that's actually very useful. Because what we did with the science, with the habits, is basically sort of show people the steps to a better behavior, which is kind of notice that you're about to say something mean, inhibit that response, and communicate in a clean way, and then showing people what clean looks like. And I think those 3 steps, it's almost like an if-then plan, right? If you feel yourself, getting worked up, then, pause for a moment and communicate in a clean way that doesn't leave a residual of, of disquiet for the other person. And then we're able to like map out what those mechanisms are in the brain. I think it's an interesting way to teach it, to kind of teach civility. Like, this is what it looks like in the sort of 3 to 5 to 10 seconds that you make a mistake. So this is the new habit to build in that way. If there is anyone on the line that's interested in sort of talking more about this, maybe building a pilot together or running a briefing on it for your executive team, or doing some work together, just put Civility in the chat and your company name, and we're happy to have a conversation. Just Civility, a company name, and we'll have a follow-up conversation with you about kind of a briefing or a learning experience of different sorts. So, but let's I think move on. Emma, back to you.
Yeah, it's great. What's coming up for me, even in this discussion here, is how much civility is really about this self-awareness of what you're doing in the environment, your own emotions before you act, kind of like taking an assessment of the situation, whether you're responding to someone or before you act. So it's really this kind of like self-regulation piece, which is effortful, and it can create this like baseline neutral level of civility in the workplace. Not to say that it's easy, but this next step that really kind of aligns with what Janet is describing as respect is this like deeper sense of pro-social behavior that's coming up. And it really takes just like a next level of cognitive resources, whether it's a social risk you're about to take or whether it's a physical risk that you're about to take, to kind of step forward and take perspective of another individual. So it is going to be a bit more intentional to change the attitude and change the belief system, as opposed to just kind of making sure you're self-regulated in the moment, which, not to say is easy, but it is something that is the first step. And the second step takes that larger shift in mindset.
Well, and to follow up with that, you use the word intention. And, it takes intention sort of on a continuum. It takes intention to not be incivil, but it takes a lot more intention to be respectful. And to your point, that's a little bit of a threat with that, a little bit deeper you have to go. But at the end of the day, that is where inclusion in the workplace comes from. Civility is where, just the ability to function comes from. But if you really want inclusion, you got to move along that continuum to respect.
So here's a question it's come up in our discussions as we were planning this, is if you want to respect someone, do you also have to like them? And Janet, what's the answer to that? I think a lot of us.
Absolutely not. But you also don't have to respect someone to like them either. Really, it's imagine 2 coworkers. Okay, so Jamie is a blast to work with, funny, energetic, always keeping the party going. But Jamie is incredibly disorganized and unreliable. So you like them, but you don't respect their work. But then there's Tracy over here, who's super efficient and skilled, but also blunt, a little bit arrogant, doesn't play well with others. You don't necessarily like them, but you respect their contributions. So it is highly possible that you can like somebody and not respect them, or respect them and not like them. And that did come up in our conversation, and we got kind of a laugh about that.
Absolutely.
That's
Any
funny.
thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I think my thought is I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. Maybe in the chat, let's hear some comments from folks. We've got lots of people participating today. Do you have to like someone to respect them, or like what do you guys think in the chat? The question from William is respecting someone's contributions the same as respecting the person?
No, it's not. And that's a very good point. It's not. So it does, that you're right. That's a very good point. That's sort of the superficial level. I think that, but I would say that respect is sort of a growing thing. I do believe that sometimes we start respecting people by respecting how we interact with them. And so maybe respecting somebody's work is sort of the first step. Because if you really don't respect somebody, I don't know that you would respect their contribution. So maybe it's not the work itself, it's the contribution. And I'm trying to think about my own life. Do I have people that I don't respect, but I can respect their contribution? I think I can, but there's going to be some degree of respect at some level that has to happen for me to even feel that way.
Yeah.
Really tricky if you don't. Yeah, it's possible, but tricky. So, people are saying you don't have to like someone to respect them. It's the general consensus, which is interesting. I like the comment earlier as well, just to go back a little bit, that someone was mentioning that the companies sometimes, when they roll out programs about respect, are just focusing on trying to remove the negatives. So they're really doing civility training, but calling it respect training. And that can easily happen. So, you run a program about respect, and it's really about, anti-harassment and bullying and, all these things. So, and so it ends up being really not about respect. Interestingly, it's about, not being uncivil.
Mhm.
I'm told we can say incivil or uncivil, but we're going to oscillate. So I think it's an interesting challenge. I mean, we're trying to say that civility is a clean distinction of, that you should use for kind of the removal of negatives. And if you're trying to add positives, you probably want to think about respect and not muddy those. That's my perspective anyway.
Well, we wrote something about this 2 years ago. And but before the word was really taking over in the workplace, it is a really big word right now. It's a really big word. And I think that the reason it's a big word is because we are seeing these behaviors that are incivil. And it's because of the lack of respect, I think, that we are seeing this behavior. But you're right. If you muddy the things, you don't really fix a deeper problem.
Yeah. There's a great question in the chat from Kim Clark. And she's saying, hi, oh, no, I'm losing it. Can you talk about nice versus kind culture related to civility versus respect?
That's a good question. Um, I think they sort of, mirror what we're talking about here. People can be nice to each other, which is basically just sort of very surface. You're not mean. It's sort of like David saying, niceness is the absence of meanness, and that's table stakes. That's just what you want people to be. It also is not challenging anything. Kindness requires you to do something, to step outside of your comfort zone, to actually have a reason to care. And that's a little bit deeper. So I think those is sort of the same thing. That's back to David's point. That's adding something to it. It's not being neutral.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for those who probably lots of people don't know, Janet's really just got such a deep wealth of knowledge and experience thinking this. And I was just looking at your recent book lately, Janet. For folks who haven't seen it, I love the title. It's The Fine Art of Not Saying Stupid Shit. And I'll put the link in the chat so people can see it. But there's a lot about this in your work, and about kind of not making a mess of things, which is both civility and respect. And so it's something that I know a lot about. Interesting.
Well, another thing is, if you think about this, sometimes civility and respect, power dynamics play a huge role in that. If you are in a higher position of power, it's easier, I think, to be civil most of the time. That's just good behavior. But sometimes the respect part is a little bit harder to do. And as leaders, that's incredibly important, because leaders have an outsized influence. So understanding that difference and seeking to be additive, to me, that's how we actually build not only an inclusive workplace, but a truly effective and successful workplace. Because if you think about what we do, we push for diversity because we say we want people's input. We say it drives innovation. If you don't respect the people that are there for their diversity, not in spite of it, then you don't ever get past that point where you actually leverage it. So to me, respect is not just about being nice to people. There's a business reason for it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we've been talking about how these are definitely different terms, maybe on some kind of spectrum, where you really need to start with civility and build towards respect. But what does it look like? So how can you even tell that you have a respectful workplace? What are those, like, maybe 3 basic behaviors or actions, Janet?
Let's see. Well, I mean, we're going to get a little bit more into the science of this, but when I think about what respect looks like in the workplace, it starts with the things you have to get over to get there. I mean, it starts with working on the things that are going to get in the way, your unconscious bias, your insecurity, your threat state, and basically your lack of exposure to people that are different. But it's really about seeing people as in group or out group. And so the way it looks is when you have sort of stepped over those things. So if you talk about, biases, when you have worked to mitigate your biases, it's a whole lot easier for you to see the things that are getting in the way. So and like I said, we'll get a little bit deeper into the science of it. I'm gonna ask David to do that. But some of it is having empathy. Some of it is being willing to see another perspective that's not like yours. Some of it is actually valuing somebody's difference on a day-to-day basis. David, what do you think?
Yeah, we were thinking about this experience of respect and like, what does it look like? And one of the interesting insights we had was there's not like one pathway to developing this capacity, that there's sort of an underpinning set of cognitive behaviors, but there's quite a few different pathways you can get there. I haven't thought of a metaphor for this. I'm not really sure, but it's almost like, I don't know, making breakfast. There's lots of, having breakfast. You can go out for breakfast, you can make breakfast, you can order in breakfast, you can, clearly I'm hungry. You can, there's many pathways to eating breakfast, right? There's no like one way you should do it, right? Maybe you should mix it up. And I think in a similar way, respect is sort of an outcome in a way, and there are these different pathways. So we were looking at the different work we do, and I realized there were sort of three main pathways that gets to respect, and I think let's dig into that a bit. I think there's this one pathway that's essentially introducing one of the stickiest and most potent kind of almost like happy viruses into a company, and that's growth mindset. And we've got over a decade of data from hundreds and hundreds of companies and tens of thousands of people showing when you introduce growth mindset, people literally like open their minds every week, right? Now, when I say people, I mean like 90%. Like a good outcome for us is, and we'll measure this, is 90% of people every week are shifting their mindset at least 1 to 3 times, and they weren't doing it before. And they're talking about it to others. So growth mindset's a really interesting tool to notice when you might be kind of closed about something or someone, right? And it has this pathway, it has this sort of mechanism, I should say, of making you more thoughtful about your attitude, right, overall. And so, you'll go up to someone that you might be about to be disrespectful to, and you'll be like, oh, maybe I have a fixed mindset about them, right? And you'll notice you're basically more reflective. You'll notice your automatic prepotent responses, right? You more through growth mindset work. And then also, interestingly, one of the habits is one of the 3 habits that are really central that we really anchor on is basically asking for feedback. And when you get people doing that, even like a couple of times, they're like blown away with how useful that is and how much information other people have. And they just get this like deepened curiosity about how other people see the world, and a little bit of humility. So the growth mindset route is interesting, right? It makes people more like aware of their responses. It makes people more able to shift their responses, and it makes people more curious about other people's experience. And the outcome of that, if you're measuring it with their teams would say, oh, my boss seems more thoughtful. My boss seems to, like appreciate me more. My boss seems to kind of ask me more questions. And the outcome is people feeling more engaged and, ultimately feeling more respected. So that's one pathway. And we'll talk about the others, but Janet, what would you add to that, or Emma, sort of the growth mindset pathway towards respect?
Well, I would say that, the growth mindset pathway there, that's the internal work you do. Where that shows up and how that pushes out, especially in a DEI context is, think about it. If you open your mind, if you grow your mind, if you have a growth mindset, you are better able to see, value, consider other people and what their contributions are and maybe what their perspectives are. So it's huge. That's definitely one way towards it. And And it's almost a prerequisite that you have to do that. So when you're doing that internal work, it probably, I can't imagine that it wouldn't, but it definitely lays the groundwork for the external work you have to do to be more inclusive in a diverse environment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly like if a company says we want to do DEI really properly, we want to really move the needle, we're going to say, let's start with growth mindset because it makes people open, right? Makes people curious, makes people, interested in others' perspectives, see people differently. So it does lay this foundation. And I think the mechanisms there are kind of more, let's be lazy and call it self-awareness. But it's more metacognition, like more thinking about your thinking, more ability to change your automatic responses, and more interest in other people's perspective. So I think that's what growth mindset does. And it's one possible pathway. Again, there's, you want to have breakfast. It's not always right to cook it. Sometimes do other things, but that's one pathway. Emma, do you want to add anything there on growth mindset?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to look at it. And I love the idea of imagining growth mindset more as a foundation, because it is it's a huge shift in mindset, and it allows you to just view, even when you're wrong, as something to learn from. Sometimes, and in some studies, they've shown that being wrong actually triggers a bit of a reward response. So you're actually encouraged to learn about where you differ in perspective from someone else. So just that mindset shift allows you to see others not as competition, but someone to learn from. And so it allows you to maybe seek perspective and listen a bit more intentionally, which are two of the major pillars of actually being a bit more pro-social and taking the time to ask for another perspective. So your brain is just looking for other things to learn from. Whereas a fixed mindset is one that's completely closed off, and you see others as competition, even yourself as competition, as opposed to this like open field to learn from.
Nice.
And to add to that very quickly, to David's point about feedback, that is also foundational to allyship and being able to see, because allyship is ongoing. You make mistakes. If you can't learn from your mistakes, or if you're not willing to admit that you made a mistake and then seek to figure out what that mistake was, as an ally, you can't grow. So it very much is foundational. Growth mindset is foundational to actually creating equity and inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, let's talk about the second pathway. And again, these are all like different pathways to a similar endpoint. Should we talk about the bias pathway, I think, next? Yes. Such an interesting one. So, our work on bias started a long time ago, and it came out of research we did with heads of talent and heads of learning and heads of leadership and heads of people and all this, basically around this one year. We ran all these events and said, what's the one thing that you can't seem to solve and you're investing in the most and you're most concerned about? And there were all these issues, and then there was bias. And this was like nearly 10 years ago now, that like bias was one of these things that companies were really, really anxious about. They were actually spending a lot of time and money trying to fix, making no progress at all. And for us, we looked at that and said, wow, that's a real sign of we're missing something in the science, in how we're approaching it. And we thought we'd take a year or so to crack something. And 4 years later, after publishing and then retracting, we finally found something that was meaningful. And it's been an amazing journey. It's because bias is such an interesting thing, but what teaching people about mitigating bias does, and it's not so much teaching them about bias. Teaching about bias doesn't do much at all. You got to teach them about how to actually mitigate bias. What we find that is there's this moment, first of all, that people need to have, that's not like, oh, I'm biased. We never try to make people have that moment. It's this moment of like, it's possible to feel really, really right about something and actually be really, really wrong. And it's sort of a very powerful moment when people have that. I'll often sit down with the CEO and say, something like, have you ever made a really important decision, like to buy a company or invest in a person or build a strategy? Have you ever like made a decision you were really, really sure about it? And 3, 6, 12 months later, you were like, who was that person? Like, who made that decision? And realized it was you. And every CEO I've ever asked that to has looked at me quietly and said, don't tell anyone, but yeah, it happens all the time. And like, what is that? And so sort of realizing that it's possible to feel really right, actually be really wrong. It's sort of a stepping stone to realize that your brain is not perfect and you can't actually trust everything that your conscious mind spits out to you. A lot of it is garbage. A lot of it is very biased. A lot of it is amazing, but you actually got to check, and it creates this. Especially when we walk through the 5 categories of bias with people and they start to see them everywhere and label them. And honestly, like that day, people go to meetings and they go, oh, look at that. There's a safety bias. Look at that. There's a similarity bias. They start to see how pervasive the biases are. And just, and they start to, about 78% of people start to call out a bias every week that they weren't before. That's what we see when we teach this. What it does, it gives them humility. And a lot of the biases can only be mitigated by getting other people's perspectives. One of them in particular, which is the experience bias. Like you just can't address that without other people's perspectives, right? And so it's not that it creates disrespect for yourself, but it creates this sort of slight disquiet that you actually won't make the best possible decisions if you don't really take in other people's perspectives. Yeah. And it's this thing a lot of leaders will talk about. I try to surround myself with people much smarter than me. Like, yeah, you need to, because you'll only see a slice. If you've been trained as a lawyer, you'll only see the world through the lawyer's perspective. You can't see the world through a marketer's perspective or an engineer's perspective or a customer service perspective, right? Or even a customer's perspective. You just see the world that way. Anyway, I'm on a rant now. But the point is, when you teach people about bias, the bias pathway, it's a different mechanism than growth mindset, right? The growth mindset is sort of more awareness and a little bit of interest. With bias, it's like even more active, like really reaching out for other perspectives and really challenging your own thinking more. And it creates these conditions that you kind of want other people's input. So it makes you respect other people in a way. And as soon as you start doing that a few times and making better decisions, you're like, wow, I need other people. I need other people to be the best, performer that I can. And that creates conditions for respect. Emma, speaking of respect, you want to say something?
I know. It just keeps coming up because you're talking about biases, and we've been thinking about just one of the limiting factors for respect is just that we get hung up. When I think of bias, I think of the things that just like hang us up a bit. They get in the way of us seeing the world and making decisions that might be best for us and for others, our organizations or whatever. And the one that really gets in the way, I think, of respect is, and just like delays us in that behavior, is the similarity bias that we talk about, that our instant either attraction for a group of individuals or avoidance of a group of individuals. And it's, everyone has it, and it's all based on our prior experiences and just the way our brains are made. And so that's the struggle, is that we do have to find ways of getting over them. So that similarity bias, we tend to group people in our in-group based on what team we're on, or based on the color of our skin, based on where we went to school, based on, like what state we live in, anything really. It's so easy to group individuals into your in-group, but then what it means is that anyone that's outside of that group, you'll feel less empathy for, you'll feel less motivation to help them, you'll understand them less, just default. And so it just gets in the way. So it really requires us to find ways of getting through that first, which takes intention.
Yeah, let's dig into that. That's a mechanism I think it's really, really important to understand. I was sort of talking quite generally about bias and sort of the disquiet it gives you, but there's this really, really important insight inside the similarity bias, which is the first S in the SEEDS model. And similarity bias it's basically in-group and out-group. And it's similar to relatedness in the SCARF model as well. They have a similar sort of mechanism or brain mechanism, but similarity bias is basically the way people that feel similar to you are given priority processing. And more than that, Jason Mitchell at Harvard showed that you process similar people's thoughts like you process your own thoughts, like literally like talking to yourself. Whereas people who are different to you or dissimilar, you use a whole different brain network to process everything. And people have taken that kind of study and run with it in all these different contexts. And we see that like basic perception is different. based on whether you think someone is in group or out group. And if you don't know the concept, the construct, in group is, having similar goals, it's us, it's, you're on the same team, you feel like you're sharing things with this person. Out group is like, they're different to me, slightly dangerous, they're on an opposing team, or maybe we have competing goals. And all those things kind of create in-group and out-group. And it's fascinating how easy it is to create in-group and out-group, which makes it actually a very well-studied thing in the lab. Lots and lots of people have been studying what happens in the brain when you create in-group or out-group, and it's really easy to switch them and, all this stuff. But what we see is at a basic level of perception, in-group members, they're not just given like deep processing, like you perceive everything more richly. And even there was one study showing that they just took people and created them as straw, like points of light moving across a screen. And you even processed points of light moving across a screen differently in the brain based on in-group or out-group. Like it's very deep processing. And then around empathy and motivation was interesting. There's a lot of different studies, but there's one I think that's just kind of fascinating, which is you'll get kind of two teams, your home team and an opposing team. And they'll see in the brain what happens when you think that your home team won, you get a big reward response. And then when you think an opposing team won, you get a threat response, right? And then you see your home team lost, that's a threat response, right? And you see your opposing team lost, that's a reward response, right? And you see this really, really clearly in the data that we're rewarded when people that feel like us win, and when people who don't feel like us lose, right? And so there's it impacts perception, it impacts whether we have any empathy or not for people. Like people who are in our out group that we think are really different to us or have competing goals, we can kind of treat them inhumanely because we don't actually classify them as human in a way. We can do really bad things because we've decided they're different to us with competing goals, and it sort of doesn't matter what we do. So look, there's a whole raft of research around perception, around empathy, and around motivation, that basically everything you do is different based on this distinction of, is this in-group or out-group? So at the end of the day, you could say respect is classifying someone as in-group. It's very hard to have respect for someone who is out, who you believe is out-group, who you believe has competing goals to you. You'll just kind of automatically disrespect them. Like you'll automatically grimace when they win, right? You won't even know it. You'll subconsciously be unhappy when someone in your out group loses. You'll be happy when someone in your out group loses. You won't notice your face doing it. So almost like respect is sort of creating in group. And I think teaching bias, and particularly similarity bias, is a really interesting path to that whole body of research, and kind of realizing that you need to create in group with people, and then having those, creating those shared goals in particular as a way forward. Janet, what do you think? What's your reflections there?
All the above. And, one of the biggest obstacles, of course, to respect or including people is bias. And, David and I always have this go back and forth about the two different kinds of cognitive versus implicit. And those words are difficult to understand. But if you think about in a simpler way, the cognitive bias that we're born with, that is evolutionary, that's what's going on in our head. We're not aware of it. And so if you, once you become aware, and once you have a way to mitigate it, then you can start working on it from the inside out. But then, even then, when you take that cognitive bias and sort of drop it into society and the ways, the different lived experiences that we have, or what we see and read and how we're raised, then you get a different kind of bias that determines what your behavior is. And so if you start with the mitigating inside, it will by default help you mitigate outside. And that's when you can become inclusive, and that's when you can start respecting people. But I always think about in-group. The example I always think about is I went to a small college in the South, and a while ago, and there were plenty of times that we just did not get along, very different opinions, different things. But once we got out, there were different in-groups and out-groups while I was there. But once we got out, we would tell everybody, it's a small college. We are very much an in-group, but that in-group didn't happen while we were actually physically there together. Once we got out in the world, those memories, those perceptions gave us a different group. And so now we have an in-group. And now that some of the differences that we had, age changed it too, but some of it is having that we're all wildcats. And because we're all wildcats, there's something that happens differently there. So I'm a firm believer in group, out group happens. If you want to actually get over, respect people, create a new in group. Make somebody else a part of an in group. And then it's a lot easier to get over your bias, to listen to them, to see them in ways that you do an in group that you wouldn't as long as they're an out group.
Right. So the sort of create shared goals with people and create a group together, where you're sharing those goals. Those are the mechanisms for mitigating similarity bias and creating respect. You'll respect people dramatically more when you've got things to do together. When you've got a shared goal, it's kind of flips them to in group. So interesting. So just, lifting up a bit, we've talked about growth mindset as a path to respect. We talked about like addressing bias and teaching people how to mitigate bias, right? You teach people how to mitigate bias, you're creating the conditions for more respect on so many levels. Let's go to the third pathway to respect, and then we'll have time for questions and some comments and all that. But the third pathway is similar but different, and it's the pathway around inclusion, right? And so you can do work on addressing bias and learn to like see the biases and address them. And you'll make different decisions as a result, maybe put in different systems. But everyday inclusion is has some crossover, but it's actually a different set of muscles. Everyday inclusion is about how you speak to each other, how you communicate, how you interact. And those of you who know our work, know we draw on the SCARF model a lot. SCARF describes what's going on in the brain during social interactions, and inclusion is really sending positive SCARF signals. Right. So positive signals of status, of certainty, of autonomy, relatedness, fairness, and address that. So in an inclusion pathway or approach, right, with an organization, we're teaching people about toward and away and getting people to recognize like when a threat's happening. We're teaching them about the challenges of social threats, like a status threat and a fairness threat. So we're teaching people to recognize SCARF threats. And in particular, teaching them to send these positive SCARF signals ahead of time. So we're actually teaching them to like not create, let's say, for example, a status threat, right? So not having respect for someone is going to result in you creating status threats, right? You're going to kind of put them down. If you don't respect someone, it's going to come out in your tone of voice. The person's going to detect it, right? So it's just the way it works, the way we work. It'll happen unconsciously often. If you don't respect someone, you just won't pay attention when they talk to you, right? You'll cut them off. You'll respond very slowly to their comments or emails. And people will detect that as a status threat. So teaching people about inclusion and SCARF in particular, and threats, you get to see the threats you might accidentally create. By being disrespectful, and you'll practice essentially being respectful. So sending positive SCARF signals is actually being respectful in many ways. The two are sort of connected. And of course, fairness is also another one. If you don't respect someone, they'll feel treated unfairly. They'll feel like you're not fair with them. You're giving opportunities to other people. They just won't feel treated fairly. So I think status and autonomy will really play out. But essentially, going that pathway, it creates an awareness of the way you impact others, which is quite different to the growth mindset pathway, right? Of just sort of being more interested, and the bias pathway of kind of noticing, how your thinking works, right? This is about noticing how other people react to you and responding differently. So like I said with breakfast, there's no one way that you should always get there. Different pathways. I think all these pathways can get to respect in kind of different ways. But Janet, just saying with inclusion for a minute, what are your thoughts on kind of the inclusion pathway and how that builds respect cognitively?
Well, you talked earlier when we were talking about the point of it being additive versus neutral. To me, that's where inclusion is. It is additive because you are then consciously deciding to bring somebody in, to create a different group, to do that. When I think about, weaponized or not, the term DEI, the I, inclusion, to me is the most important thing. And it is the one thing that when you truly want to leverage diversity, which is the easy thing, you can get bodies in the building, you can do that. And equity is probably one of the harder things because that's that's just a hard thing to do. But inclusion is the one thing that we have intention about. And so when we talk about respect, if we truly want to build respect, inclusion is the way we do it, because you can't respect somebody that you don't understand. You can't respect somebody that you know nothing about. It's kind of hard to do that. You'll stay in your in group. And I'm a firm believer, I said this in my TED Talk, that the workplace has the best opportunity for us to do this. It's the best opportunity for us to build respect, because it's the one place we are going to be confronted with people that are different, and the ability to have it, see and value, it's an opportunity to value a different perspective. And that's the inclusion pathway that lets you do that. You learn the behaviors, you practice the behaviors, and then eventually, if you do it enough, you are going to open up and you are going to be able to pull somebody in, and you are going to be able to respect them.
Yeah, interesting. Let's dig in some more. And I want to get to some of the interesting questions in the chat. Before we do this, let me just kind of get this out of the way, so we can kind of move on to some great questions. But if you are interested in learning about these pathways, and I'll put this in the chat, just put the name of the solution and your company name, and someone will follow up. But there's a way to build a growth mindset across any size organization in a month or a quarter, without any in-person training. It's actually better than in-person training. There's a way to build like bias mitigation skills across 100,000 people in a month or a quarter. Again, much cheaper, much faster, much better than in-person training. And the same with inclusion. So we have these, if you're new to us, we have these ways of doing this. But just I'll put it in the chat. Grow is our solution for growth mindset. Decide for bias, and include for inclusion. Just put any of those names and your company name in the chat. Someone will reach out and share some resources with you, see if you want to chat further, to kind of understand how you can build that capacity. And you can also put these together, grow, decide, include, work amazingly together in a pathway as well. But I just want to kind of get that out of the way. And now we can get to some interesting questions. And maybe before we do that, Emma, what's coming up for you as you think about these three pathways, growth mindset, just, bias and inclusion? What's coming up for you as you think about these three?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think they're all needed. I mean, we've been talking about them separately, but as this discussion has developed, I'm thinking, the growth mindset and the seeds work is really like the bias work is really about yourself, opening your mindset up to shifting and understanding what are the decision points that get in the way, or the things that halt us from actually engaging and asking for someone else's perspective, or seeing their perspective as maybe correct or different from ours, and that being okay, or what are the things that get in the way. But then the inclusion work is all around that intention, as Janet is talking about, and the action, understanding all of the signals that might cause a very immediate threat in someone else, and sending opposite of those to encourage them to feel that sense of status. And that's that action, that pro-social behavior that's needed to create more of a respectful set of interactions, is that intention, using up some of your cognitive resources to show someone else that you respect them and provide them with a sense of value. So I think all of those together, are needed to get and maybe foster this sense of respect.
And I would say that order that's a good order too. Growth mindset to bias mitigation to inclusion, because to me that builds away. So there are different pathways, but you use each pathway and then you can actually go on a full journey to respect.
Yeah, I mean, the pathway it's increasingly popular. We have a lot of partners who maybe start with one and then realize that you can add, and it becomes kind of the main approach. The other nice thing about this approach is you can share this language with the whole company, including frontline employees. You can share these ideas, models, tools, and really scale them in an interesting way. So I can see some folks putting that in the chat. Someone will follow up relatively quickly for either growth mindset, breaking bias, or inclusion. So some interesting comments and questions coming up in the chat. Emma, any you want to pull out?
Yeah, there was one that came up that I'd love to ask your thoughts on, is just the idea of, from Dr. Don, if you do not see the person as equal, how can you respect them? I think that's a really interesting question. What happens if you don't see them as an equal?
Yeah, that's the status problem, right? You see them as lower status. And as a result, you don't really pay attention. You don't really care about their thoughts. I think about sort of people's motivations and their goals. as the sort of two building blocks of what makes someone human. So if you don't care why people are doing something, what their motivations are, what matters to them, and you don't care what they want to do, their goals, you just sort of treat them as a concept. And I think I sort of think of in the brain when we conceptualize people, when we're like a straw person without motivations and goals, right? And we sort of, so we're just not treating people as people. And when we're treating people as concepts without motivations and goals, right, we're going to be disrespectful without even realizing it. So I think, you know, when you're seeing yourself as higher status, you're seeing them as lower status, you're going to accidentally be disrespectful. And I think that's, but then what happens when you create a shared goal, right? Now you're increasing relatedness, right? Now the status matters much less, right? When you have a shared goal with someone who's much higher status than you, you're now got relatedness and it offsets the status threat that might be there. So you see a lot of clever leaders will, like, you know, talk about the dumb things that they did recently to bring down their status, and then talk about all the things that we need to do together, right? We got to do this together, right? That's relatedness. And so it creates a, you know, diminished status threat. So I think it's important, but the solution here is back to you know, shared goals in a way, to create that relatedness. And so then you're going to have respect as an outcome. It's almost like I keep coming back to sort of respect as the output. It's like profit or something, right? It's like the output of doing good work, versus something you sort of directly can go at. I think if you directly say, hey, David, can you build us a training about, you know, how people can be more respectful? It's like you sort of end up at don't be disrespectful, and you end up back at civility. You end up at, you know, don't say mean things, right? Whereas I think the way to create the positive is, you know, growth mindset, bias or inclusion work, which really builds cognitive habits that actually makes people more respectful as an outcome. That's kind of how we see it at the moment.
And to that point, to the question, think about who's going to have a hard time with that. A lot of times it will be leaders, because by default, by hierarchy, they don't see people as their equals. And so it's going to take a different kind of work. But the idea of creating a shared goal, you know, anybody who's heard me talk knows that I'm firmly a believer that the tying diversity to business outcomes is important for a lot of reasons. That is that shared goal. So if you are in a leadership position and the hierarchy of the organization gives you a very real status that makes it hard for you to see people as equals. But if you are working towards a shared goal in the company to do things within the organization, automatically that shifts. So I'm a firm believer that that's one of the ways you can help do that. Tie it to business.
Yeah, that's a great point. One more great question. Can you unpack how ERGs do or do not fit these pathways? Do they help or hurt?
I think that is a choice. It depends on what ERGs do. I've always seen employee groups on kind of a continuum, and they start out as affinity groups, which is sort of like the lifeboat mentality. You're just there, you find each other, people who have shared goals with, you become sort of that in group you created. Then it goes a little bit further, and when it becomes an ERG, then you're advocating for the needs of that group. And then most organizations want you to get to be a BRG, where then you are taking the things that are unique of that group and using it to leverage it. But if you're in that ERG phase, I think that you have come together as an in group for something, for some sort of shared belief. As an ERG, should you choose to be the kind of ERG that goes out and tries to pull others in, that tries to bring unity among the different groups, then I don't think you're getting in the way of respect. I think because if you want to be respected, you have to give respect. And so all the things that we talk about, all the things that you can do, fight your bias, you know, deal with your threat response, have growth mindset. Those things in an ERG framework absolutely can build a culture of respect.
Yeah, interesting. It's a contentious one because you know, the research is really complicated, and it's really easy to sort of say something and it'd be taken out of context and shifted another way. But you know, ultimately and please don't, you know, take me to task over this, but ultimately you want to celebrate differences, but really focus on shared goals. And if you just like celebrate differences, and focus on those differences without the umbrella of a shared goal, you can have a lot of outgroup, right? You can have a lot of us and them. You have the silo issue in companies, right? If marketing is celebrating how amazing they are and how different they are to finance, it's not really going to be helpful unless marketing does that, finance does that, but then there's this overarching, understanding of what they've got to do together and the incredible work they've got to do together and how much they need each other. So the full story is you want to celebrate differences, but you want to also really focus on similarities, and have that superordinate goal and really focus people on that. You think about the planet, right? We should all have a common goal in the planet of having a sustainable, healthy environment, right? Living in Florida right now, it's quite poignant for me. I'm in Miami, we were fine, but a couple hundred miles away, they were not fine at all. And people lost their whole livelihoods and everything, and like a 100-year storm. And so, as a planet, we should have this superordinate goal of all working together to make the environment more sustainable. And then celebrating the individuality of countries. Like, Spain's an amazing country. Spain doesn't have to look like Germany, right? Germany doesn't have to look like Italy. They can all be amazing different countries, but we should all be working together on this goal. And in a similar way, in a company, a similar sort of thing should be happening. It's kind of both.
You're right. And I think that something you said just came immediately. That's where respect comes in. Because if you understand that there's these individual differences, and then you understand what the value of that difference is to whatever that shared goal is, you're starting to respect, because you're valuing that difference. And so you're right, just celebrating it and saying we are different, that doesn't help. But celebrating it as in recognizing it and acknowledging it, and then saying, now, how does that difference bring value? That's when you start getting into the area of respect.
Yeah. No, really true. And such a great point to start to close off, I think, because I can't say anything more intelligent than that, Janet. So respect your incredible deep thinking and knowledge in this space. So I'm going to say, Emma, back to you.
Thanks. No, this has been a great discussion. I know, maybe if there's one last thing you can think about, suggesting as we approach, what really triggered us to have this two-part series is, the change in, in civility, or the increase in incivility, whether it's perceived real or not. We're thinking that it is. It might only get worse. What would you suggest as whether it's individual contributors or leaders as we continue going forward? What are the lasting words you'd like to send out, David?
Janet, after you.
Be intentional. Be intentional. Understand that this is not something that happens organically. It takes intention. So if you respect, to David's point, respect doesn't just happen. You have to decide that you want to work and create it, and it's necessary.
Yeah, for me, it's like don't invalidate people's perspectives. It doesn't mean you have to agree, but you're not invalidating, and then quickly get to shared goals. I think this is a time where organizations need to just focus people on the missions that they need to achieve, and just keep bringing people back to that. That's the goal overall. I think so. Fantastic, great conversation. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Janet. What a great, rich conversation. And for those who haven't heard us say this 1,000 times, hold the date for the summit. It's going to be amazing. October 29 and 30. Some new research, some really powerful new research on accountability and AI and creativity, all sorts of really cool things. I'm excited. So we'll see you probably next week. And try and hold the date for the 29th and 30th of October for the summit coming up. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Janet. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We had our poll up, but let us know how we can help you in the future. As David said, Summit 2024 is on the way, October 29th and 30th. You do not want to miss it. So for all your information, you can visit summit.neuroleadership.com, and everything will be there that you can take in, and we hope to see you there. If you enjoyed today's conversation, we also have our podcast, Your Brain at Work, so you can listen to that wherever you listen to your podcast. And this is where we officially say farewell. So on behalf of our team behind the scenes, thank you for being here each week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.